While making Portal 2, we explored our way through vast quantities of reference material. Inspirations included photos of NASA's Apollo and Shuttle programs, CERN's particle accelerators, both modern and obsolete, industrial robots, derelict Soviet space shuttles, overgrown temples, Brussels metro stations, seedy American motels, junkyards filled with rocketry equipment, Chinese apartment blocks under construction, Polish shipyards, neutrino detectors deep underground in nickel mines, corporate headquarters from a variety of eras, commercial nuclear reactors, experimental fusion reactors, rain-sodden book depositories in Detroit, peculiar cameras, forgotten space probes, you name it.
The size of the gigantic transition seal lock was a happy accident. We knew the connection between the old aperture and the new aperture had to be a big set piece. The first model built was about 5 times bigger than everyone expected, but people started to like it. We joked that it should be a bullet point on the Portal 2 box. Features the biggest door in games ever! We decided it would be fun to play with the player's expectations, and put a puny looking door behind it, along with a few small props.
Lake map marks a total reset to the aesthetics and scale of the environments up to this point in the game. You come into the underground cave compressed, and as you progress further into the map, your eye is drawn upwards by the elevator tower, sparking cables, falling debris, and finally the test spheres which recede vertically into nothingness. This looking upwards gives the player a sense of the vastness of aperture before GLaDOS, and a visual sense of the daunting climb they will have to make to get back to Wheatley. The open areas encourage the player to explore their surroundings and take a break from the intensive puzzle solving of the test chambers.
There's 1,000 tests performed.
This chapter gave us a great opportunity for visually telling the backstory of aperture science. We accomplished this with signs, props, and materials. In this area, we get a glimpse of what aperture science must have been like in its heyday. We used rich, warm colors and materials like carpeting and marble to indicate that aperture had a lot of money at one time. Cave Johnson and his staff were just starting out in their enterprise, and everyone was eager to do science. This stands in contrast to the stark, cavernous environment outside and the materials you see in Aperture Lab from later decades. As the player makes their way through more recent areas of the lab, the materials become cheaper, with an abundance of plastic and linoleum showing that Aperture had fallen on harder times and could no longer build high-quality offices for its workers.
Similar to the way the student game Narbacular Jop became the original Portal, the paint mechanics in Portal 2 come from a student game, Tag: The Power of Paint. The repulsion gel in Portal 2 is modeled after the bounce paint from Tag, but was redesigned to fit better within Portal. The original bounce paint always bounced the player at a fixed height and activated whenever the player touched the paint. We changed the repulsion gel to reflect the player's velocity such that they will bounce back up to the height that they fell from. This mechanic lends itself better to puzzles involving portals because players have to think about gaining and preserving height. We also changed the repulsion gel to only activate if the player jumps off of or falls onto the gel. This was done because players would often accidentally walk onto repulsion gel that they didn't see and then trigger an unwanted bounce. This was a particularly nasty problem in Portal 2 because the player couldn't get rid of paint once it was applied, whereas in Tag the player can erase paint at any time they want.
We had to come up with old-looking versions for all the important gameplay props, such as button panels, doors, cubes, basically everything the player could interact with. We came up with this fictional character, Janitor Bob. He'd be the guy who had to maintain all of old Aperture. A guy who doesn't understand anything about science, but can fix everything with duct tape and a screwdriver. He would use everything he could get his hands on. The result might not look pretty, but it would work. So whenever we got stuck designing props for Chapter 3, we'd ask ourselves, well, how would Bob build it?
I like your style. You make up your own rules.
While re-implementing the paint mechanics from our student game Tag: The Power of Paint, in the context of Portal 2, the biggest change we made was to exclude the paint gun. In Tag, our paint gun allowed the player to paint the environment freely in an abstract outdoor environment, but in our gameplay experiments, that was very difficult to constrain without contrivance in Portal 2's indoor spaces. It also changed the game's pacing significantly, since being able to run at high speed around a level covering everything in paint is a lot more fast-paced, energetic, and often scattershot than Portal's more cerebral gameplay. Perhaps most importantly, there is a certain elegance in the simplicity of manipulating all the game elements using only the portal gun. Adding a new gun would inherently add complexity and force us to start from square one training the player how to use this new tool instead of focusing on the game's namesake. Instead, we decided to use the established mechanism of the delivery tubes and have players redirect the flow of the paint with their portal guns. This felt like a good compromise.
That might be a fear reaction.
One of the things that the student game Tag the Power of Paint didn't allow was painting of other objects, since this would have been too trivial in that game. In Portal 2, however, moving paint around became a puzzle in and of itself, so we began to create puzzles that depended on painting objects. Bouncy boxes and turrets were an obvious choice, and adding this mechanic extended our toolbox to include objects whose basic properties of movement could be changed by the player.
Standing here listening to me means you've made a glorious contribution to science. As founder and CEO of Aperture Science, I thank you.
The newer and older versions of Aperture show their distinct personalities in sound as well as visuals. The doors, floors, and buttons, as well as soundscapes, reflect the aging, outdated 70s feel. The sounds contain hints of the decaying metal and wood. The newer but unstable Wheatley Chamber soundscapes become more foreboding and perilous the further you venture into them. The atmosphere of uncontrolled destruction continues to intensify till the end.
The character of Potatoes was actually the hardest one to crack for us, and was the last character to get recorded. We'd always wanted to switch things up for the sequel, so that Gladys would become your unwilling buddy cop partner against a new threat. But this ended up being far more entertaining as a concept than an execution. It's one thing to have an omnipotent villain chastising you while you're testing, it's quite another to have a little potato on your gun doing the same. Playtesters wanted to tear her off the gun, and we didn't blame them. So we were faced with the unsettling prospect of making dry, robotic supervillain GLaDOS more human and relatable. This ended up being one of the hardest writing jobs in the game.